All right. Good evening, everyone. So, my intention really was not to make a video about this, but just given the complexity of the situation itself, I felt extremely compelled to speak out on it. I am speaking out on it in multiple different ways, but one of the ways that I want to speak out on, that I have chosen to do so, is really just by video. And so this is really just coming from a place of hurt, a place of concern, a place of care and empathy. As a Muslim woman, clearly you can see how I look, but also someone who spent much of their life in Europe. And so I should probably mention this. This is particularly going to reference, unfortunately, what is happening in France. And as many of you know, I've obviously spent a lot of my time in Europe. That's where I was raised, and have called my home for pretty much my entire life up until I moved to the United States of America, which was roughly a few years ago, close to 7-8 years now. Now, we're going to take a step back, and for those of you, of course, that are not even familiar with the situation, I'm not going to go into too much detail, so I'm going to leave that for your discretion. But something that I want to kind of start off by is really just the fact that social justice has just always been a shortcoming for the French government, whether it's the policymakers today or whether it's the policymakers in the 1500s. So 19th century to the 21st century, it doesn't really matter. This is really not unique or new to France, and obviously not so unique, new to other European countries too. But for the first time ever, people are really saying this is the worst that they have ever seen. So that's kind of really what is frightening for anyone that lives there, anyone that cares for France, anyone that's invested in France. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, that doesn't really matter. But people are really, really frightened for the first time. And like I said, whether this is related to the prosecution of the Protestants, people having to flee France to Germany in the 1500s, to today's climate of Islamophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric. But of course, France has really played, when you just think about their history, whether it's locally or internationally, played a major role in its part of injustice. Now, to name some of the worst, of course, perhaps it is the worst, France really played a leading role in the slave trade. And I like to reference anyone who was a slave as an enslaved person, because obviously there's a difference between a slave and an enslaved person. So whether that's, and I think this was back, kind of just thinking through the chronological order, it's the 1628 to roughly 1642, French sailors essentially just captured foreign individuals from Africa, put them in their ships and brought them to France. But that's beside the point. And then, of course, we know the history of colonialism. Now, if you are someone who is from the eastern parts of Africa, you know the devastating impact colonialism has had, and the fact that lines have always been drawn on agricultural land, or land that has land that would really cause friction. So that was also part of the strategy that they had. We're not going to get into that right now. But fast forward to, today, and just in terms of my career, at least, my background is in urban planning. I pay attention to the built environments. I pay attention to a lot of stuff. But when it comes to urban planning especially, I mean, that's really where my experts lie. And something that this video really brings me to is just thinking about what I had learned about some of the urban planners and their history and the contribution and role that they had. When you think about it now, even 125 years after the death of Haussmann in France, and a lot of the work that he did was just reference to Haussmannization, I believe. Haussmannization, yeah. And, some people will say that it has, still been a major division for the French. Some will say, well, this is the man who transformed Paris into the city of lights, and some others will, and he was a great, master planner, and others will say, well, he was not. He was an arrogant man who ripped the history and the heart of Paris, driving his boulevards through the city slums to really help crush the popular uprising. So that's the other side. Now, I bring this up because really France just has a complex history, and whatever your conclusion is, my point is France has a dark history, and like many other countries have a really dark history. This is not unique to France, but like many countries today, we usually do not talk about the history, because if we feel like it was dark, it's just kind of something that we say, well, it's time for us to move on and maybe pick another topic. But it's not discussed in mainstream media, and of course it's not covered in our education system. Very much similar to the United States, how we convey our dark history. They also do the same to cover some of that trauma and the real historical facts. Now, on the flip side, of course, France's diversity is really one of its biggest strengths, and you could see that if you are a football fanatic like me. We call it soccer here, but if you are, then of course they won. You would know that they won the World Cup. And what was the breakdown? Well, the breakdown was 80% were Africans and 50% were Muslims. Now, this was such a unique group of football players that it consisted of black, white, Arab, Christian, Muslim, you name it. The players were mostly immigrants or descendants of immigrants, which is a really important factor. And I think if you're really not familiar with the current events of France, or even have not spent much time in France, maybe you're not going to be moved as much, but I'm extremely sad and frustrated, quite frankly upset and angry with the current situation. And I say this because the country itself is so divided right now, and there's so much fear-mongering on all the different groups. And President Macron has come forward and said, we will crack down and do X, Y, and Z. But in that process, that we does not include everyone. There is a group that is completely being isolated and excluded from this process. And just evidently, I think in France right now, when you think about the policies that are coming forward, is really a frightening blueprint. And I think that's really what's so scary at this point. And if you kind of just think through some of the examples that I shared, in the planning context, think of any minority group, whether they are black, whether they are Hispanic, whatever the group is. If you isolate a group, you disinvest in them for decades, you target them in policing, you stigmatize them, you do all of these specific policies and practices to cripple their life, to cripple and not allow them to thrive and give them an opportunity like the rest of the community. Naturally, they become deviant. Naturally, they are poverty-ridden. Naturally, they become disinvested too. That's a very common human trait. Now, this is not to justify any violence that could occur as a result of it, but it certainly explains why they behave the way that they do. Now, you will see somebody here that might be financially struggling, somebody who is perhaps feeling isolated because the community has failed him or her. You feel targeted. You feel like you're not part of that society, and that's a problem. I think our leaders have a responsibility to bring everyone in and call for justice when it's needed. In the Quran, it says, whoever kills a person, it is as if that person killed all of humankind. If you kill one person, it's as if you have committed an assassination of every single mankind. It's dangerous. It's unacceptable. There should never be a situation where anybody is compelled to kill somebody. No. So that needs to never happen. Muslim or non-Muslim, it doesn't matter. But unfortunately, what happens is, whether it's a secular group or not, a religious group or not, there's a long, humiliating journey of no return for so many groups that have been victim to these issues. And the selective silence and disproportionate control over certain communities has also really been so evident in parts of France and even other parts of Europe. And I really fear that when we talk about the chaos right now, that maybe things will just really escalate and get worse until there's a real good medium that is so grounded on justice. And by justice, I mean for any criminal or any activity that brings about pain and misery to another group of individuals, whether it's in the form of prosecution, mockery, humiliation, even murder, there needs to be consequences. That's what governments and policymakers are for, to hold people accountable and say, you committed this crime, now you're going to go do the time. Period. And when we show empathy, we should show empathy as mankind. We need to show empathy and unity towards all the injustices. I'm not thrilled to see that a group of people have decided to mock somebody that I value and deeply adore. But I know that mockery is just a mockery. It doesn't make a difference of that individual. That individual's quality as a person, they've been elevated beyond any elevation in this world. So it doesn't really matter. But what's frustrating is to see the responses such as, well, it's okay to hurt or bring pain in the name of free speech. That's also unacceptable. So I'm going to condemn that too. I will condemn, like I said, the acts of violence. I will also condemn the acts of violence that has happened to Muslims for the sake of being Muslims. Just not too long ago, here in Philadelphia, a lady, I forgot that, I think her name was Helen Jones, an African-American Muslim grandmother, was attacked for no reason beside the fact that she was Muslim. Somebody literally threw acid on her face. Two Muslim women in France under the Eiffel Tower were stabbed. They're also dead. Now, I really feel like European countries have failed in their intelligence. you look at London, for instance, it's the most surveillance city, I think, in the whole world, actually, if not the entire of Europe. And we're still not able, by we, I say we because I grew up in England, we still do not solve crime at the rate that we probably should be. We still do not have the intelligence to be proactive and stop all of these acts of violence that are about to take place because of the excessive monitoring and tracking that we've been doing. People in Europe are really heavily surveillanced, and unfortunately crime rates are still high. It's horrible. So I wonder if this is a policy issue. I wonder if this is a selective surveillance issue. I don't know. I'm really sad and confused and angry, but I guess what I will do, a couple of things that I'm gonna do, but one of them is definitely to pray for France. Things can't go on the way that they are. It needs to stop. And so, you know, if I'm curious to know what some of you all are doing. What media outlets are you watching or following these stories as they unfold? If you're not, and maybe you're just watching my video for the first time, maybe this will encourage you to stop following it. It is a Wednesday evening, and I really didn't plan to make this video and speak for so long, but here it is. I'm gonna end it here, and just ask for everyone to remember we only have one world. We need to learn how to share and live in harmony, because if we can't do that, then there's nothing left. Our purpose as humans, no matter what religion or faith or way of life you believe, is to be kind to one another. And at the basic level, acceptance and tolerance, not just tolerance, but really acceptance and the ability to live side by side in harmony is so critical, whether it's in France, and I pray this doesn't happen elsewhere, but it's a frightening blueprint that is currently being shown to the masses of us. And whatever way you can, please refrain from picking a side if you feel like this is a sided issue. This is a people issue, and I think it's so important to just be very clear when it comes to justice and stay and focus, so that justice can always prevail. Thanks for listening. Bye.